It is the Global Business Report here on Arise News. Let's talk jobs. The Nigerian Economic Summit Group with a report that says here, from hustle to decent work, unlocking jobs and productivity for economic transformation in Nigeria. This is the priority of every administration on planet Earth. Now, the jobs picture for Nigeria, very interesting, since the Bureau of Statistics decided to go with the International Labour Organization's metric for recognizing a fully unemployed person as working at least an hour a week. So that means that Nigeria's unemployment number has come down to single digits. So for Q2 2022, 4.3%, down from Q1's 5.3. This is where we're going to really be focusing today with our guests. Youth unemployment, 6.5% in Nigeria for Q2 2024, down from 8.4 in Q1. Urban employment, 5.2. Rural employment, 2.8. And we're also going to be focusing on this here. Informal employment, 93%. That's a lot. Now, you're going to compare this with Ghana, where they just put out their Q3 2025 unemployment numbers, 13%. But look at youth unemployment in Ghana, 32.4. We go to South Africa and it is even higher. South Africa's Q3 2025 numbers, unemployment there, 31.9%. And look at youth unemployment, 58.5. It was 62.2 in the second quarter of this year. So we're just going to we're putting that up there just for the purpose of comparison with Nigeria's single digits and the double digits in South Africa and in Ghana. So we're going to have a conversation right now with our special guest, Dr. Wilson Erumebor, Principal Economist at the NESG. Dr. Wilson, good to have you. You're welcome. Good to see you again. Have a seat. Let's have a conversation on this very, very pertinent topic. So I do want to start with your thoughts on the Bureau of Statistics, I guess, going with that ILO standard. What do you make of our numbers when you compare them to others? So what do you make of just the rejigging of Nigeria's unemployment figures?
Well, I think what we've done, right, is to move away from, the usual way of, having unemployment, underemployment. Before, it was if you do nothing or you work below 20 hours, 1 to 19 hours, you are underemployed. But with the new change in methodology, with that, we had about 33.3% of Nigerians unemployed, in the labor force, and that was the latest number for that was in 2020. So, but now when the National Bureau of Statistics decided to adopt the ILO methodology, so that share, declined significantly, and we're talking about 4.3% unemployment rate in Nigeria, which means that our unemployment rate is almost comparable to countries like France, and some advanced economies. Yeah. But I think what's even important, we've debated this whether or not it's right or wrong, because working 1 hour in Nigeria, how much can you really get out of that? Those are, critical issue. But what's even more important is that we should not look at unemployment statistics in isolation, just say 4.3%, and it makes it look like everything is fine, but it's not. One of the numbers you showed there, informal employment at 93%. Yeah. That's so high. So it means a lot of people are working, basically, but are you working to, take care of your family, to earn enough to take care of your family? Are you working in a place where you have better working conditions? I think those are the critical issues that we should pay attention to. So, unemployment rate is low, but we should not look at it in isolation. We should look at it holistically and look at all the other labor market indicators, which are very important.
So speaking of those labor market indicators, so just to build on the informal employment picture. So there's that, and then there's also the self-employed versus the wage employed. And the self-employed, I think with the data that you folks put together along with MBS, that I think was for 2023, 85%, right, self-employed versus 15% wage employed, and then you've got this large informal sector. So what essentially does that say about the labor market for Nigeria then, when it's so heavily dominated?
Yeah, it just means that many people in the labor market are hustling.
Yeah.
Nigerians are just struggling to make ends meet, right? So formal jobs is very scarce, right? And if you look at countries that have developed, that moved from one point, one stage of development to another, what you'd find is that the creation of jobs at a large scale, and not just informal jobs, but formal jobs at a large scale.
Yeah.
You would see that happening across those countries. But for us in Nigeria, we've seen a case where, because the private sector has not grown strong enough, I mean, right now we're doing growth about 3.9% GDP growth, or depending on the quarter. Because the private sector has not grown enough, and sectors that are labor intensive are struggling. So it just means that there are not enough formal jobs to cater for the huge number of Nigerians, 3.5 million, entering into the labor market each year. So people resort to just, petty trading, subsistence agriculture, POS operations, if you like, and many other subsistence activities just to earn a living. So that's part of why you see a case where wage employment is just 15% of people in the labor force, which is really, really low.
Now, there's a chart in your report, and I want to get to the states now, looking at the share of private sector employment versus the public sector. I have to say I was very surprised that Borno State is in second place there. So for our viewers, the private sector employees are in the blue bars, and then the public sector are in orange. And Lagos, Borno, Kaduna, Plateau State, Oyo, top 5 there. And then you've got your Kebbi, Ekiti, Gombe, Jigawa, and Zamfara, which are on the other side, have the largest set of public sector employees. Should when you talk about strategies for creating jobs, should we be looking more at the states? Should we start at the state level? Because I know a lot of people we talk about these things at the federal level and so on. What's your thoughts on that dynamic?
Yeah. First, on these statistics, you mentioned that Borno is close to Lagos, but I think what's important, when you use shares, sometimes you have to be very careful of how you interpret data. So, for instance, if 90,000 out of 100,000 is 90%, 9 over 10 is 90%. So there's a thing with scale when you look at Lagos and Borno. So because we're looking at percentage of workers that earn wages, so you also need to pay attention to the absolute numbers,
right?
And then you would see that there's a huge gap between Borno and Lagos. But what's even important here, is to look at the far right, and you look at states that are where the orange bars are higher than the blue bars. So you'd see that in those states, government employs more workers and more wage earners than private sector. So it just tells you how small the formal private sector is in across states. And if you move further, you see that in about 13 states, government employs over 40% of workers, that earn wages. So it still tells you the same picture. And little wonder when you go around states across the country, you see that activities are clustered around state capitals.
Right.
Sometimes when FAC allocation comes, activities get busy. So there's still that heavy dependence on government, and as opposed to expanding the depth and breadth of the private sector, which is one thing we looked at the report, that if we must create jobs, it's the private sector that creates jobs.
Yeah.
So we need to build hubs, economic hubs, regional hubs, and see how we can get businesses to move out of just within a cluster and create new zones, new economic zones for prosperity. And I think that's really important for job creation.
It is indeed very important. This is an obvious one here. Education, informal employment, and the level of education. So no formal education, 99% of folks, that are in that sector, then 97 for primary education, lower secondary 94, upper secondary 67, post-secondary 26. As far as what is the education sector missing here? Is it funding? Is it, because I know we need to get more educated people to get better jobs. Yeah. So what's the
funding? Yeah, funding is very important. But like I always say, in Nigeria, we know how to throw money at problems, and we think money will solve all the problems. Yeah. But most times it doesn't. So we're talking here about a systemic problem where you are talking about curriculum, for instance. How do you align that with what the private sector needs? I was in a meeting recently where we had senior government officials, and then we have one of the leading private sector guy who was on the board of the NESG, and he employs thousands of people, runs a big company, one of the biggest manufacturing firms in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the need for skills and vocational training, just so that it can align with what they want, from the business side. And the minister or the government official was simply saying, we've revamped the curriculum. So the question is, how do you change a curriculum when the largest employer of labor is not even aware of that process and is still asking for that? So what we emphasize a lot more is that industry government collaboration as far as curriculum design is concerned. So we're talking here about linking funding, for instance, to learning outcomes. It's not just about going to school and access, to education this time. It's about what are you learning and how useful is that going to be in the private sector. So I think that's something, improving teacher quality, effectiveness of our training programs, and even collaboration just within government alone, because there's so many skills training programs out there that sometimes you wonder, is there some alignment? Is there a bigger goal that we're looking at so that everything can be connected, just so we can, have that more partnerships across board. So I think those are the very important gaps that we need to fill going forward.
Okay, perfect. So now let's talk to skills. I think you can be educated but still lack skills, right?
Yes.
I mean, yeah. So the report did point out that the country is not creating enough mid-productivity level jobs. There's also a low supply of skilled workers, and then of those few skilled workers, they are now migrating to other. So how do we close that gap?
Well, I think first of all is training. We just have to keep reskilling and retraining our people. But one important point we made, and I also made this at the summit when this report was being presented, is that let's not just train people and hope that the jobs will come.
Right.
Let's see how we can expand the private sector, but at the same time, link training to jobs.
Okay.
So it's not just about doing ICT programs, and saying, okay, we're going to train 3 million people. Where are the jobs that would that they
absorb
would
those 3
these
million
people?
Yeah.
So there has to be that holistic effort to say, as you're training, make sure that you're carrying the private sector along. You are also expanding the private sector in terms of access to finance, infrastructure, in these economic zones that we talked about, just so you can create the opportunity for that skill to be utilized. Otherwise, when you train them, and we've seen this in the past, and there is nowhere to go, they move abroad.
Yeah.
So that's one key message we're sending in this report, that not just training, but training with the idea that there will be the expansion of the private sector to absorb these workers. So I think that's something important.
Okay, fantastic point. But there is still a gap, right? Business Day had this article on the top 6 skills that are needed for Nigerians in 2026: machine learning, cybersecurity, data analytics, software development, digital marketing, soft skills. The money this will cost, though, Dr. Wilson, because there's, here, this station, looking at, interacting with interns that come into work, a basic laptop they don't have, right? And I don't know how far you can go in trying to get up the employment if you don't even have a laptop. So I guess government has to address that in terms of the amount of expense that we're looking at to try to upskill.
Yeah, it cannot be left to the private sector alone. In fact, what you see in other countries is that governments set the agenda. For instance, how many engineers do we need? How many doctors do we need? How many lawyers do we need? What we looked at in this report is that Nigeria needs to create 27 million jobs from now to 2030. And we're talking here about 4.5 million jobs every year.
Yeah.
Just to maintain unemployment rate at 4%, that's how much jobs you need to create, 27 million jobs. And those jobs, most of it has to be formal. So what sectors, manufacturing, construction, ICT, and professional services, we think, would account for a significant share of those jobs. And all of these areas, are very critical: machine learning, cybersecurity, even machinists. people that can run machines. We need a lot of those. Just imagine the narrative we heard about Dangote refinery needing welders, and they just couldn't find as much as they needed.
Right.
That's not something we should have in Nigeria. So those are critical gaps that I think is not just about the private sector. Dangote, maybe he did it because, of course, he has the financial muscle to do that. But from a countrywide perspective, there has to be that partnership between the government and the private sector across all of these areas. I see no reason why government cannot give companies funds for training, why we cannot, link, development financing to training for workers and say, okay, how about targeting training XYZ number of workers, across these sectors and delivering these skills in the next few years. If we do that, it's not just only about government doing the training themselves and setting huge targets, but it's saying, look, as your business grow and expand, you need more workers. And so these are the funding, these are the support you need, and this is how you can create those workers. I think so that collaboration is very essential in filling those gaps.
Now, so I've been debating folks on the NEL fund and how it's, funding students in school, in university level, and it's been a well, embraced initiative from the government. But I have talked about how the funds, like initiatives like that, should focus on STEM students, right?
Yeah.
I want to get your the science, technology, engineering, math. Do you think, and I know that's, I don't want to not acknowledge other disciplines, right? Yeah. But for where we're trying to go and where things are, and, this whole focus on tech, AI, and so on, should Nigeria have a strategy that focuses on STEM?
Yes, of course. I think STEM is very critical. What I would say to that is prioritize STEM, but at the same time understand that there are other areas that we need to focus on as well.
Yeah.
Some of those sectors, construction, for instance.
Right.
In some cases, Nigeria still get workers from abroad to do some basic things. You see how somebody fixed the plumbing in your house or even the painting. You don't get satisfied if certain people do it, right? So you go for people who are skilled, and some of them come from neighboring countries. Even in the leather industry, I recently found out, speaking to some businesses, that there's some Senegalese. They are very skilled at making leather products. Nigerian outsource some of their productions to them. So you see some of these things happening around. So STEM is very critical, especially if we're talking in the FIR, Fourth Industrial Revolution. We need to train people, we need digital skills and all of that. But at the same time, there are other areas, construction, manufacturing, professional services, that I think are also very important.
Yeah.
So it should just be how we can then balance all of these out, just so we don't create focus on one side and create huge gaps elsewhere.
Fair point. All right, so final question for you, I guess. Ultimately, and you've made a really strong point here today about how you shouldn't just be throwing money at training people without a parallel strategy with creating jobs for those people. Ultimately, what's the takeaway from the report here in terms of, I guess, I know the audience is the federal, it's the government and so on. So what's the main takeaway?
What we're saying here is that over 60% of Nigerians are in multidimensionally poor.
Yeah. And
we've seen a case where there's some macroeconomic stability in the last couple of quarters, right? The next level, and where we need to focus on to lift these people out of poverty, to lift the majority of Nigerians out of poverty, is to create jobs. And not just jobs, but to create better jobs. And we're saying this has to be a national priority. How you create the jobs matters. How you engage with the private sector matters. The state government, how you expand, economic activities across states, not just in state capitals, but beyond state capitals and other urban, semi-urban areas are also very important. So productivity has to be very central in all of our discussion. And finally, what I would say is we came up with a framework which we called the Nigeria Works Framework.
Okay.
That we have to look at this holistically and say, look, We have to look at the informal sector, for instance. We said 93%. How do we address that? And what you find is most times the solution or the attempt to address that problem is always how do we formalize this business?
I'm guilty of that.
And
I'm guilty. I'm guilty. Yes,
and then you say things like, "Oh, let's bring them into the tax net and all of that." But it's all that's about what the government can get from them.
Right.
The other side is what should the government do to them? What should the government give to these businesses?
That would incentivize them to want to be formalized in the first place. Yeah.
So how do you create new markets? Upgraded markets, for instance, better markets. How do you link the growth of businesses to finance and say, okay, if you register, become formal, we will give you some support. And that support, we will track you and ensure that you're able to grow and employ people. And as you do that, we give you more money. So you are incentivizing businesses to grow and expand. So that's how we thought about upgrading the informal sector. So it's beyond formalization.
Yeah.
There are other issues relating to data, how we measure productivity and track it. Most times you struggle to find data on productivity. In fact, it is a struggle. And we think that the NBS needs to be properly funded. And this should be core. We should move beyond just GDP growth and say, look, how do we measure and track this every quarter just so we can know when we're making progress? Ultimately, it's about creating better jobs for Nigerians. We need a productivity fund. We need to, improve the Jobs and Productivity Council, which we already have, and many other reforms that we proposed in the report.
Dr. Wilson Erumebor, Principal Economist at the NESG, Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Great report. Thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us. It's a very important topic, getting Nigeria productive and creating more jobs.
Thank you.